Maintaining a successful podcast can feel really overwhelming if the type of podcast episode that you're creating every single week is not matching the style of host that you are or your availability. And so this podcast episode is going to be delving into the types of podcast episodes that you can have on your show and how to best utilize them to grow your expertise, to deepen your connection with your audience, and also to make sure that you're not overwhelmed. In case we haven't met, hi, I'm Annick Xavier. I'm the founder of The Podcast Space, a show that will help you get unstuck, elevate your podcast journey, and improve the way that you're using your podcast as an effective business tool. Let's dive right in. Having produced hundreds and hundreds of hours, by now probably thousands, of podcast content and working with dozens of podcasters all around the world, I've come to realize that sometimes the success of a podcast is more based on the fact that there was matchmaking in the type of podcast episodes and the type of personality that the host has. So this episode's going to be a little shorter, but very practical because I want to give you the tools in order to improve your podcast. So whether you're just starting your podcast journey and trying to figure out what you should be focusing on, but also for those who have been podcasting for a while and the joy of podcasting just went up and disappeared in thin air. So I want to make sure that you have all the tools. And as a small business owner, you do this already, right? You don't do business like most people do. You determine the best way to do business in your own way. And it's the same thing with podcasting. You have to determine what type of podcast episode is going to help you be sustainable, create content that doesn't burn you out, and that just keeps giving you leads for your business, keeps getting people excited, and just sets up expectations with the audience. Because if we're not creating content consistently, if we're skipping weeks, if we can't make sure that we are releasing on the schedule we said we would, the audience is not going to stick with us. So let's dive into the different types of podcast episodes that you can have. So let's start with the most obvious one, right? You can determine that you want to do a solo podcast. I do a lot of solo episodes on my show. You can do interviews, panels, rotating hosts, and a combination of all of these. Now, there's no such thing as like the wrong format. It just depends on like matching the format to the style you have, but also making sure that you're listening to the previous episode, determining your why. And so solos are great for building audience connection. So the episodes that I do with just me and you, just the two of us, are the ones that I always hear the most around. Like people say, hey, Anna, this was so great, or I feel like you were talking to me. Are you just in my head, right? Because I'm just talking to you and I'm using words that are talking to you directly. I'm not saying y'all, I'm not talking to people in general, right? I'm bringing you in constantly on those solo episodes. So I am bringing a lot of intimacy to the show. So interviews are great for networking, but also to cover topics that you may not be an expert in. And so a panel is fantastic if you just want to have a lot of reach and you want to create a podcast that is very dynamic. Now, just understand that a podcast that has more than 3 people is something that is going to be a little difficult for the listener to figure out who is talking. And as a former journalist, things that I would always be told, if you're interviewing people, make sure that you're not getting people who have very similar voices together. So if you're asking questions, and this was in the editing, to be honest, but in real time, you can also do this. So if you have, for instance, someone who identifies as a male or has a male voice, mix those in your conversation as you're asking questions. And sometimes it's making sure that you have variety in those voices, also a variety of opinions and backgrounds. So when you're going into the next one, which is rotating host, if you're part of a collective, if you're part of a group of people who maybe you're peers and you want to launch a podcast and you feel like you could launch a podcast, but it would be really overwhelmed, you could tap into everybody's audience and you create a stronger podcast. That's a great opportunity to create something that maybe you wouldn't be able to do on your own because you just feel like it's too much. But when you're sharing it with other people, you share responsibilities. You're also sharing audiences. Now, a combination of all of this is possible, but you have to be aware that you have to say what the consistency is, what is the structure. So ideally, you want to let the listeners know when you're using those interviews and almost like what is the purpose, right? I never said from the get-go that these podcasts was going to just be me. I said that it was going to be me, sure, and I would talk to guests. And there are seasons where there's more interviews with guests and seasons where it's just me. Now, when that doesn't matter, and you'll definitely need to listen to the previous episode where I'm talking about your why, some of these podcast episodes, I am using them to network with decision makers. I still give you value from these episodes, but sometimes they're a little off because maybe the guest asked me, hey, I know we're talking about this, but I have a book coming up. Would you mind bumping the interview to a specific date to help me create awareness about the launch? So that is fine, right? Like if it's just an exception, there's no problem about that. But just make sure that there's some sort of rhyme and reason to this. Now, moving into types of episodes that can be recorded or live. As someone who's done live radio, I will tell you that our brains work in really mysterious ways. So I mess up so much when I'm doing these recorded episodes. And when I'm doing live interviews, I don't mess up as much because I just know I have to be on my game. Doing these episodes recorded, I just know, quote unquote, like I'm not on fight or flight mode kind of thing. So I'm not as focused as I would be if I'm just doing a live episode. Now, there's also like less editing that is involved when an episode is live. So making sure that if you're someone who does not do well on a live scenario and you really want to make sure that you're hitting all of the different things, maybe you're just starting your podcast journey, maybe you want to do a recorded episode. Then when looking into the type of content itself that you can create in these episodes, you can create content that is repurposed or original. So what this means is that you're creating content for the podcast first, or you're repurposing from other mediums. So maybe you did an Instagram live or a YouTube live, and you could also have guested on other people's podcasts and you want to repurpose that content, right? So it's just looking at, there's no right or wrong way to do it. You can also be clever about your time, especially if you're just trying to, maybe life got crazy and you ended up not having pre-recorded episodes in the can or, something ready in time. Life happens. So if you did create an amazing live content, just repurpose it on the show. You just have to make sure that it makes sense for the podcast that you have. And then we're looking into how long these podcasts can be. You can decide that you want to do micro episodes, medium, or long-form content. So micro episodes are anything that is kind of like under 15 minutes, right? Or to be honest, it's more like under 10 minutes. Medium format is anything from 10 to 35 minutes, 45 stretching it, and from 45 to up to 3 hours. Podcasts that are 3 hours long are normally ones that are only released either once a month, or they have a whole team of people working. Again, going back to how are you creating these podcasts? How realistic are you about your time? If you're someone who is really busy, maybe you can dedicate the 3 hours every other week to create this type of episode. Something that is also important to understand, apart from your availability, is looking into what your listeners are saying. Even though it's great to create content that is useful, what is the purpose of creating episodes that are 1 hour long, 45 minutes long, if your audience does not have that time? So I would invite you to listen to episode 47, How to Read Analytics Like a Pro, because I'm covering how to figure out if your audience is listening all the way through. And one of the things is to look at your consumption rate or retention rate. They are used interchangeably. So you want to make sure that when you're looking at these types of episodes, you're looking at, if you're just starting from scratch, you can do market research and ask your community, how do they listen to podcasts? And specifically, how do they like to consume your content? If this podcast was 40 minutes every single week, I would not be able to deliver a weekly podcast. I change it up with interviews or topics that are sometimes a little more in depth, with content that is on the micro side, that is under 10 minutes. As I am recording this, I know that this episode is going to be one of those that I'm just bringing you a lot of awareness about the possibilities. There aren't like, quote unquote, a lot of actions for you to take, but is one that I know I will use time and time again in my business. So I want to make sure that this episode is in depth. All right, we're getting to the end of the episode, and I want to cover as well types of episodes that most people don't do that I think are such winners and create a lot of momentum and just buzz online. So consider creating themed episodes, and it can be like a season. So for instance, when I went on my sabbatical last summer, I decided to create a Summer Spark series. And what these Summer Spark series were micro episodes kind of covering quick wins and things for you to think about in the summer. So these were things like how to quickly grow your podcast visibility and place your podcast in these 9 places, or how to know if your podcast is successful, right? Like all of these things are very practical, but you can create like a topic one-on-one. This series specifically, Podcasting One-on-One, is one of those. So best of inspiring stories. So at the end of the year, these are great to use if you want to take a break. You just select your most popular episodes, or maybe the episodes that didn't get too much love, and you're like, I think these should get more love because maybe when they were released, there was a lot going on. So the last one would be like women only, or then look at like, let's say, Black History Month. You want to make sure that you're covering Black founders and people who are inspiring, or you're covering their stories. And when you're thinking about when you're taking inspiration from, again, it can be original content, or you can say, hey, I saw this movie and it made me think of this, and I want to actually talk about this industry that I'm in through the lens of this movie. I've worked with a client that did one of those, and it was just so interesting because it was the kind of content that she's the expert in, but that documentary made her think about things that she had never covered. So it really helped her navigate that one topic. And it was just so easy. And then lastly, types of episodes you can use. I know this isn't for everybody, but I actually know 2 podcasters that do replays as part of their content structure. These podcasters, when they started using replays on a consistent basis, they were already on 200 episodes. So they released 1 episode, I believe, that is original content, and 1 replay that same week. What this does is that, 1, it bumps up your podcast up because you have more downloads per week. It teaches your listeners a lot of the old content that they may have not accessed before because they just didn't follow your podcast before. And also at the same time, it increases your visibility because you have more content to showcase. So if you're someone who is thinking about that, you should absolutely look into that style. I have released 52 episodes, and I still haven't released replays because, again, this podcast so far is a tool for my business and to create educational content. So for me, I feel like I'm still not on that phase of my business where I can use replays. But if it was to happen that a week I couldn't record and I needed to use a replay to not skip a week, or if I had to take 2 weeks almost like unexpectedly, I could definitely do that if I wasn't able to meet that deadline. So again, always remember that a replay is not a lazy approach because it's just your audience is evolving. Some listeners stop listening to your show. Other people come into your community. So there's just so many things. And also something to know is that listeners tend to follow on 2 categories. Super fans who will consume every single episode you release and will replay multiple times. And then the occasional listeners who will normally tend to pick the episodes based on title or their needs. Or maybe they listen to the episode because they follow the guest and the guest shared that episode and they're like, oh, let me go and listen to these podcasts. So again, you can't just assume that everybody listened to that same episode. So just absolutely use it. All right, it's time to wrap it up. I know for a fact that this episode gave you so much insight into different ways to podcast, different ways to create content that is less overwhelming. And if you want to continue your journey in learning and improving your podcast, you can work with me. I'll leave the links in the show notes. But for all the offers that I have going on right now, visit thepodcastspace.com. You have courses and my coaching as well. So make sure that you visit those. And if you just want to share all the good things that you've learned on this episode, and just talk to me. Follow me at The Podcast Space on Instagram. I'll be there waiting for you, rooting for you, celebrating with you. And until then, just keep creating content that's imperfect but moves you forward. Have a great day.